But today we have Dr. Jonathan Bloch, who joined the Florida Museum of Natural History at UF in 2004 after receiving his PhD from the University of Michigan. He is curator of vertebrate paleontology, chair of the museum's Department of Natural History, and associate director of research and collections. How he finds time to come here and talk to us, spending a whole morning, I don't know. In these positions, he works with the museum's 30+ faculty curators, 22+ collections managers, and over 90 graduate students and postdocs involved in cutting-edge collections-based research on the world's biodiversity and cultural heritage. And by the way, the Florida Museum is one of the largest university-based natural history collections in the world. Even with his increased administrative responsibilities, John still finds time to hunt fossils of ancient mammals. Every summer, he collects fossils in the Bighorn Basin of Wyoming, but one of the most famous finds was in a coal mine of coastal Colombia. John was a co-leader of a team that found Titano, thought to be, or actually was, a giant 45-foot long, 4-foot thick constrictor snake that lived about 58 million years ago in a tropical rainforest. And the museum developed a special exhibit on Titano, if you remember going to see that exhibit and realizing how big a 45-foot long snake is. Holy mackerel. Dr. Bloch has concurrent faculty positions with the departments of geological sciences, anthropology, and zoology. He has authored or co-authored more than 100 peer-reviewed publications and serves on the editorial board of the Journal of Mammalian Evolution. And I don't think we would find a more dedicated scientist anywhere. Thank you, Dr. Bloch, for giving time to us.
Thanks so much. You guys can hear me all right? Sounds really loud to me. Okay, good. Hello, everyone in the Zoom spheres. All right, let's see if I can get this to work.
Let me share it real quick.
We good?
Yep.
All right. Okay. So the format of this talk that I'm going to give you all actually is very similar to a talk that I actually recently gave in a physics colloquium here on campus. And so I didn't, I often will tone down talks a little bit and not introduce very complicated subjects when I'm speaking in public. But with this group, I decided to keep it at that same level as what I presented in the physics colloquium, but I'll try to explain things as clearly as possible. But the introduction to this talk is maybe a bit of a review for you all, for some of you in terms of other lectures that you've had in this series, as I understand it. But I will move forward then. This is just a summary of my introduction here, and I do just want to make the point that that we are a really huge, vibrant collections and research museum. Often when you think of the Florida Museum of Natural History, you think of exhibits and public programs and all that forward-facing amazing things that happen at the Florida Museum, and all that is right. But maybe a little bit more hidden from view are the research and collections aspects of what we do. And this is a very fine community of people really at the very top of their fields. And it's just been a huge honor to work with this group for quite a number of years now. And our collections are really sort of the highlight of what we do. Okay, and I also want to sort of highlight that even though I have this administrative role, one of the things that sort of keeps me sane, or has kept me sane for the last 5 or so years in that administrative role, is my own lab. And specifically, I have 5 PhD students right now. And one of the wonderful things about being at the Florida Museum of Natural History is we can have concurrent appointments in multiple different degree granting departments on campus. So I've had graduate students through geology and anthropology and biology, and they all come together to address very similar questions from very, very different perspectives. And that's been really exciting for me. And so these are just some of the grad students that work in my lab. Mitchell Riegler is working on fossil lizards from the Caribbean, addressing questions surrounding what the human impact has been on the Caribbean islands on fossil lizard communities. Maria works on fossil frogs from the tropics. And so right now she's working on a really exciting project, 2 exciting projects, one looking at the first frog communities in Florida when it becomes sort of exposed to air, but also fossil frog communities in the Panama Canal Basin back when the where what is now modern day Panama was just emerging also from the ocean. Lazaro Vanola is working on fossil rodents from the Caribbean. Rachel Narducci is working on the cranial anatomy, so the skull architecture of fossils and earthrins, which are things like giant armadillos, giant ground sloths, and she's using micro CT technology to study these fossil brains in ways that it's never been done before, ever. And I think it would be nice if Rachel came and talked to you all soon. She, with Richard Holbert just retiring, and he'll come speak to you all next week, as I understand it, Rachel will be stepping into his position as collections manager in the vertebrate paleontology collections of the Florida Museum of Natural History. And finally, Selby Olson, who's working on some of the early radiations of marsupials in the fossil record. So these are all great folks in my lab and sort of keep things real for me. This was a talk for the physics colloquium, and this is how they got my name. And the only reason I left this in here was to actually make a point about my own development in terms of what can inspire you early on in science. And they knew my name because my grandfather, Felix Bloch, is a very famous physicist. So he won a Nobel Prize in 1952 for his work on NMR, which is some of the principles behind the MRIs that we all have. And so he was a very interesting person. He died when I was just a teenager. But he really exposed me very early on to how you ask questions in science, and that science was very interesting. He also was a great outdoors person. So for me, science and being outside and thinking about the natural world, and some of that enthusiasm comes from sort of this interactions with a really amazing scientist. And for that, I was very lucky, to have that kind of exposure. And this is a quote from my grandfather, which I love, right after he won the Nobel Prize. It might have been the quote at when he was receiving the prize. I'm sure my fellow scientists will agree with me if I say that whatever we were able to achieve in our later years had its origin in the experiences of our youth and the hopes and wishes which were formed before and during our times as students. And in the museum, especially, this is an incredible opportunity to reach out to people and inspire them at an early age in this kind of way. But there's also another thing about this that actually is a segue into paleontology with relationship to my grandfather, which is that he actually worked very closely with Luis Alvarez. In fact, the two of them in 1940 worked on the neutron's magnetic moment. Luis Alvarez is a very interesting person in the history of vertebrate paleontology, especially because I don't know if you all know, but Luis and his son, Walter, who was a geologist, were the ones who proposed the asteroid impact theory to explain the iridium anomaly at the KT extinction, so the extinction of the dinosaurs. So there's a segue between my own inspiration and into the beginning of this talk. Actually, Luis Alvarez also, in my mind, my first exposure to Luis Alvarez in terms of thinking about him intellectually was through this book. I read this quote in Stephen Jay Gould's Wonderful Life. I don't know if any of you have read that book, but it was influential to me when I was early on. I read this sentence. I don't really like to say, well, and it was building off this quote from Ernest Rutherford, who was also a very famous physicist in the 1800s. All science is either physics or stamp collecting. This was his quote. That's either physics or stamp collecting. And then Luis Alvarez's quote from Stephen Jay Gould kind of alludes back to that quote, saying, I don't really like to say bad things about paleontologists, but they are not very good scientists. They're more like stamp collectors. So I think actually, that was I was interested in paleontology, so this was interesting. This perspective was interesting to me. And I think there actually is some truth to this statement. But maybe a little bit more than stamp collecting, I hope. So this is where we get into a little bit of review. I think we've had speakers maybe come talk about various parts of the history here of life on Earth. This, you can see here going back there are 600 million years to present. And during this time, there have been 5 big extinction events. And you can see those indicated by arrows as you move from the left to the right. And there's been much debate about whether or not we might be going into a 6th major extinction now, but we won't know it till it's over. That's the problem. We certainly aren't in one yet, but maybe in the future. And so just a quick review of a couple of those mass extinction events. This one is especially interesting. There have been books written about it. And this is the mass extinction that happened at the end of the Permian, the Permo-Triassic. And Mike Benton wrote a book about that called When Life Nearly Died. And that wasn't really too much of an overstatement. In fact, of the 48 animals with 4 legs that lived on land, families, 36 of those families went extinct at the end of the Permian. And so a very few number survived. And in fact, if you reduce that down to the species level, which is probably a better metric, in terms of what we know, something like 95% of all species went extinct, and it happened in less than 500,000 years. It could have been a lot less than 500,000 years. That's essentially the resolution of our rock record. 500,000 years to 0 years, or one day, we're not sure how long that happened over. And we don't know what really the causes were. There's been a lot of speculation about different ways in which greenhouse gases could have been, put in the atmosphere and had all kinds of feedback effects, including ocean acidification and so on and so forth. But there wasn't only bad news in retrospect. There was some good news associated with this mass extinction event. So the good news is 12 tetrapod families did survive. Okay, and then that set the tone for the rest of the history of life on the planet. Because this also was what we call the start of the age of the reptiles. So 220 to 230 million years ago, after this mass extinction, in terms of what survived, we see the ancestors of things like crocodiles, dinosaurs, and mammals. So they came through that, and we see the origin of mammals associated with that mass extinction event. Right there with the oldest crocodiles and dinosaurs during the age of reptiles. So when I was a graduate student, not that long, I'm kidding, it was a while ago now. When you wanted to understand the early part of mammal evolution, really the first 2/3 of mammalian history, this was the book that you looked at. And it was 321 pages long, which is a long book, I suppose. But if you're talking about the first 2/3 of mammal evolution and that it all can be summarized in 321 pages, that's not a lot of information with regards to what the early mammal evolution would have looked like. And the story that came out of that was mammals generally were fairly small. They ate insects. They hid from dinosaurs who were trying to eat them, That was it. And it wasn't until the dinosaurs went away that you would have had this explosion and diversification of mammals. That was the story when I was a grad student. So that's a fairly interesting, so that's what we thought we knew from the fossil record. However, if you look at, the increasing number of molecular analyses looking at DNA, and you look at molecular clock estimates, there's some suggestion that primates would have lived all the way back during the age of dinosaurs. And so here's a funny cartoon of maybe some kind of primate walking around when the dinosaurs were there. And so, that's one of the questions that we have, is that with increasing samples, do primates actually live during the age of the dinosaurs? Well, there's been a renaissance in dinosaur paleontology and a renaissance in exploration of rocks during, of that age. So now, fast forward to 2004, we now have a book which needs updating now, which is 630 pages. So that's a lot more pages, summarizing mammals from the age of the dinosaurs. And now we know a lot more. In fact, we know a heck of a lot more about what mammals were like during the age of the dinosaurs. And what we know is that they weren't just hiding from dinosaurs in little holes. There were a whole bunch of different kinds of mammals during the age of dinosaurs. There were ones that were swimming. There were ones that were gliding. There were ones that were climbing. There were ones where we found bodies of mammals with dinosaurs in their stomachs. So there were carnivorous mammals eating small dinosaurs. So there was a whole radiation of mammals that lived during the age of the dinosaurs. So we know, and since this time, I put 100 new papers. Since I made this slide, it's probably 150 new papers, just since 2004, on mammals that lived during the age of the dinosaurs. So with that, then what about these molecular estimates that say, for example, primates and things like that, other modern types of animals should have been here during this time? The answer is there's no primates. Or really any modern mammals. They're just not there. With this incredible sampling, we don't see, even though the molecular data tells us they should be there, we can't find evidence for them anywhere. We keep looking, but as we keep racking up information, we do wonder whether we will ever find them during the age of dinosaurs. So there could be something to think about there. It used to be easy to explain away because our fossil record was so poor, but it's becoming so good now that it's hard to explain. All right, so the other mass extinction that's worth thinking about is this one at the KP boundary where you have a bolide impact and iridium anomaly and the extinction of the dinosaurs. So that was bad news also because dinosaurs, pterosaurs, marine reptiles, the glorious radiation of marine reptiles were wiped out, totally wiped out. Sad day. That was a sad day. But good news, mammals and birds survived, which includes us. So we have the extinction of the dinosaurs at about 65 million years ago. And then you have what's called the Paleocene, where you have a lot of early experimentation in sort of a mammal radiation after the extinction of the dinosaurs. And from within that experimentation arose the modern orders of mammals. We don't really see them come into the fossil record until about 10 million years after the extinction of the dinosaurs. And that's associated with what we call the beginning of the Eocene, when things were a lot warmer on the planet today. So if you look, this is a diagram which has time here at 65 million years ago. Here's when this is the KP boundary. Dinosaurs were over here, then they went extinct, and then the age of mammals began 65 million years ago, all the way up to we essentially changed timescales here and then move forward, where we are moving up to present day here, and then we go into the future. This is future. And what we have over here is proxies for global temperature. And the way that we reconstruct global temperature varies depending on how deep you are in time. And so a lot of this stuff comes from ocean core, records from Ocean Drilling Project data. Then you get into other proxy ice core data. Then you get into historical data, and then you get into future climate projections. So let's see. Back. So coming back here, one of the points that I wanted to make here was that if you look at future climate projections, so here they vary. They vary a lot, right? It's because it's the future and the models are there's a lot of uncertainty with regards to the models, but they're all within the range of sort of up here. The sort of ones that you have any faith in at all are sort of over in here. And what's interesting about this sort of broader scale perspective is that what they're projecting for the future, which may be well up into here, you need to go back tens of millions of years on the planet, way before humans were here, to win it to a time when the Earth was ever that warm. And in fact, this was a time where there was no ice on the poles, on either pole. And that is what we are projecting. And it's not that far in our future. By 2300, current IPCC projection models predict an average temperature to be at least 9 to 14 degrees Celsius. That's a huge, huge range. But 9 to 14 degrees Celsius or 16 to 25 degrees Fahrenheit higher than that of today, bringing us into that more of a hothouse world when primates were thriving and radiating and things. So that's the difference in the average annual temperature of Gainesville, Florida, compared to the hottest place on Earth today in Ethiopia, if you want to understand how different that gradient is. So this will potentially bring global temperatures to way beyond the human experience and to the level the planet hasn't seen in 50 million years when there was no ice in the poles. So there's some basic questions here when it comes to whether or not this is just stamp collecting or whether or not there's actually some questions that we can try to address using the fossil record. So what happens to life when the Earth is that much warmer? What does life look like? It's a good question. It's probably important for us to understand that, I guess. So to answer that question, we have to travel back in time to see what the planet was like when it was last that warm. And for that, we go to the Paleocene period, which is a huge chunk of time in that hothouse world. And in fact, specifically, I want to focus on a period of time which was called a hyperthermal, which is at the Paleocene thermal maximum 56 million years ago. It's a large, rapid global warming event. There were thousands of petagrams of light carbon released into the ocean atmosphere. The onset of that climate event happened in less than 20,000 years, could have been in a few weeks, could have been up to 20,000 years. It's the resolution of our record again. And global temperature increased 5 to 8 degrees Celsius. So this is an interesting model for a very rapid type of climate change that we're going to be experiencing on the planet soon. All right, so to that, we become time travelers. Our purpose is to document the climate event 56 million years ago to better understand specifically the response of mammals to climate change. So we're going to try to understand that by collecting stamps and then studying what they mean. So for that, I'm going to bring you all to the Bighorn Basin of Wyoming, where I go every summer with my students and students from universities all over the country. If you all have been to Wyoming before, if you've been to Yellowstone National Park, if you go outside the east entrance of Yellowstone, you're into the town called Cody. And Cody's very famous for its rodeos. It has a nightly rodeo and things like that. Cody is what is in the northern part of the Bighorn Basin. And if you go south, you're in Thermopolis. That's in the southern part of the Bighorn Basin. So what I'm talking about here is basically north central Wyoming. It's a huge basin in north central Wyoming. And that's has some of the best records of Paleocene, Eocene mammals during this time, during this hyperthermal event in the world, if not the best record. And here's sort of the extensive badland exposures. These are ancient soil horizons that have been blasted open and are absolutely full of fossils. And all these red beds are red beds that develop within the context of soil development. And then they're just layered one on top of the other. These are ancient river deposits coming off of the Rockies. We call them Badlands, but they're some of my favorite, they are my favorite places on Earth, to be honest. Like I said, paleontologists from all over the country come here during the summers. There's a group of a joint field expedition by myself, Mary Krause from Denver, Scott Wing from the Smithsonian, and our crews. We have geochemists, we have paleobotanists, we have vertebrate paleontologists, we have invertebrate paleontologists, and so on and so forth, all interested in this question that I'm talking to you all about. So we like to think of ourselves as PETM time travelers. We have dry camps on Bureau of Land Management land, so these are public lands, but there's no water, so we have to bring all our water into camp, and it's a wonderful way to work. We have tents set up for cataloging our fossils. We also have these very well-used field vehicles that we bump around in the Badlands, and people wonder, who are these crazy people driving through the hills, as they call them, just trashing their vehicles every summer. But it's absolutely necessary to get back into these remote regions to study these intervals of time. We often get stuck in drainages, so one of the initiations for University of Florida graduate students when they come out is that half of the job is to dig ourselves out of holes. And they're good at it. And the way we collect fossils out there, generally speaking, is we just crawl around and we're looking for fossils that have eroded out of the rocks, and we collect what we find. And for the last 150 years in the Bighorn Basin, this has been a great way to collect fossils. However, this type of fossil collecting, called surface prospecting, is highly biased and skewed towards what we call collecting bias. So the problem is, because most of the mammals on the planet today are really small, so the most abundant types of mammals on the planet today are things like rodents and bats, and most of those are really tiny things. Like, you wouldn't know it, but if you were to, what's the most common mammal that you see outside? Oh, well, deer, armadillo, and occasional, no. Those are very uncommon animals. The most common ones are the ones you're not seeing, the little mice and there are rodents absolutely everywhere out here, I guarantee you. And also with bats, especially if you get into the tropics, very, very high diversity of bats, for example. So rodents and bats are the most diverse. And that's presumably also the case in the past, that most mammals are super tiny. So we can't really understand this question of response of mammals to climate change if all we're studying are the rare things, which is what we find when we're crawling around in 100 billion degree weather in the middle of the summer in north central Wyoming with sweat dripping into our eyes and collecting things what we can off the surface. We're going to miss all the tiny stuff. So for that, we screen wash. So we use very, very fine screens. We collect, we don't even bother to pick them up off the surface. We just shovel everything in situ out of an ancient soil horizon straight into a bag. And so here we are bagging sediment. We then take those bags and put them on our backs. And sometimes, we'll have to walk a mile, 2 miles out from where we've collected the stuff, 30, 40-pound bags of matrix. And we do 2-3 tons of matrix every year. We carry out on our backs. So if it were easy, someone else would have done it, right? So we're collecting all that sediment and taking it out and just hoping that the dirt that we put into the bags from very specific horizons has something in it. It's a lot of work, just hoping. So we bring them back to those very, well-used vehicles, load them up, and we bring that matrix and we go to the Bighorn River. And we use these nested screens and we do an initial wash we take out the coarse element and then the very, very fine element. And again, you don't really see any fossils. You just see the little rocks and things that are left over after you wash out all the dirt. And then we bag that up. This is also an incredible opportunity for us because this river runs through the town of Worland, Wyoming. And everyone sees what we're doing. And they all stop and ask questions. So this has just been a fantastic opportunity to talk to everyone about what we're doing. And the first question is always, are you looking for gold? Because there's no gold where y'all are looking. No, we're not looking for gold, we're looking for fossils. And they're like, well, sorry to tell you this also, but there's no fossils in that river. They have to tell them, no, we went to the hills, got the fossils. They have plenty of fossils in the hills. Yes, and then that is cleared up. But anyway, it's been a great opportunity to talk to people in the Horn Basin. Here's a look at what the coarse fraction looks like and the fine fraction looks like. Again, students look at that and they say, why did we just spend 2 days bringing this stuff out for a bag of rocks? But when we bring those back to Florida and we pick through them very, very, very carefully, they're full of fossils. And so you can see, for example, here is just, we have over 10,000 of these little micro fossils that have come out of these bags. These are little individual teeth of very tiny mammals. And this is a typical amount for one of these bags. You might get a whole bunch of teeth like this. But, isolated teeth can be difficult. This is not a whole body of an animal, that's for sure. But there's actually a lot you can do with teeth. So this is just a measure of how our sample has changed, since we started screen washing. So this is going back to 2003. This is just one little animal. Oh, this isn't it. But so primates, this is an example of a modern primate, are very small at this time. Back in 2003, we had very few primates from this interval. After we started screen washing, the primate specimens started to go up and up and up and up and up. And now we're actually north of 500 specimens in the collection. And these are some of the really rare things. So we're actually starting to pick up, much better representation here, for example, for this one group of tiny animals. The other weird thing is it completely flipped our perspective of what was the most abundant thing, because some of the very small things were much more abundant than the very large things, which we didn't know before. So how do we do this? Well, long story short, we found that the best way to study these very tiny things is to put them into straws, put them into a micro CT scanner, scan those teeth, and then using high throughput semi-automated morphometric techniques, essentially try to characterize the shape of those teeth, both through space and time in the Bighorn Basin. So that's a lot. That was a mouthful. But we use micro CT to better understand the shape of these teeth. And the reason the shape of these teeth is important is because they can be very closely related to not only diet of the animals, but also things like their size, but also what they are. Because mammals have very characteristic teeth. If you have a tooth, you can pretty much well say what kind of mammal it is. You can also say what kind of food it was eating, and you can also say how big it was. There's a lot of things to be able to say from one fossil. All we need to do is characterize the shape, which we can do very well with the micro CT scanner. Here's an example of a smattering of Eocene fossil mammals. I picked some of the jaws and things because they're prettier than isolated teeth. And so far, everything I've explained to you is stamp collecting. To be clear, we're just finding stuff, we're categorizing what it is, and we're putting it into boxes with numbers and putting it into a catalog. So what's next? So what have we figured out with all of these fossils? Here's some of my grad students and us trying to answer that question. What did we figure out? Well, I don't know. Maybe some things. I was intrigued by this study, which was published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science, where they tried to address the issue of whether or not the ability of mammals' dispersion, ability to disperse, in other words, move across the landscape, will limit their response to future climate change. And so a way of putting that is that, one response you might expect is that if you have warming, then you might have changing distribution of things like forests and so forests that are much happier in more southern places here in the northern hemisphere as things warm up might start to move a little bit north, as things get warmer. It becomes a better suited habitat. And if that happens very rapidly, the question is whether or not, and what are the limitations to mammals being able to basically keep up with those biome shifts? And that is very much linked, it turns out, to how big they are, what they eat, gestation length, age of sexual maturity, period to next breeding season, and on and on and on. There are many, many, many factors that go into addressing that question. But I thought this was interesting to look at carefully. The underlying assumption here is that mammals are tracking specific habitats associated with suitable climates. That is an underlying assumption. It's also an underlying assumption to all future climate modelers' assessment of whether or not things will be going extinct and so on and so forth. So as we move forward in time. And this is part of what that model shows. It's a kind of complicated thing, but the bottom line is things like artiodactyls, which are the even-toed ungulates, like this elk right here, and carnivores, things like this wolf, are super good at keeping up with climate. They have very high dispersal abilities because of who and what they are, what the kinds of things that they do. Versus these tiny little things like shrews and moles and primates are really bad at keeping up with climate change in these models. So the interesting thing about the Paleocene thermal maximum is that the climate velocity, that is the shift in climate that was experienced in, the amount of climate change that was experienced in the Paleocene thermal maximum is similar, or at least close to that of projected future climate change. So the amount of velocity is pretty similar. Over 20% of the mammals that we see during that climate event, we think are immigrants coming from Europe and Asia. And this includes the first appearance of 3 modern orders of mammals, including the even and odd-toed ungulates, the artiodactyls and perissodactyls, as well as crowned primates. That's the group that gave rise to us. That fauna also includes things like carnivores and insectivores related to modern insectivores today. Many of the groups that previous study actually talked about in terms of dispersal. So it's a good testing ground for whether or not those dispersing models actually worked during this hyperthermal event. So do mammals track specific habitats, forest composition, biome during the Eocene thermal maximum, and do they keep up with those shifting biomes? This is just a picture of a primate following a forest biome from Europe and Asia into North America during the hyperthermal event. And this is a complicated diagram that I'm not going to spend any time on, really. This is time right here. These are a whole bunch of different plant fossils, and there's all kinds of patterns that we can see. And one pattern that's really, this is the climate event right here. One pattern that's really sticks out is there are plants that were there before the climate event, and there are plants that were there after the climate event. Those are what we call extirpated plants. That just means that during the hyperthermal event there in the Bighorn Basin, they were gone, and then they came back after the climate event. Versus this pattern here, these are plants that are only there during the climate event. These are ones that just seem to go straight through. These are the ones that originated afterwards, and these are the ones that went extinct. Okay. So to sum up what that would mean, that what that pattern tells us about the plants, about the forest in the Bighorn Basin, is that when, this is the 56 million years ago, we're looking at the planet looking from the North Pole down. And so, so when the Earth started to heat up, what the plants show us with that pattern is that the first thing to happen was that some things went extinct, but plants from the south moved north. Okay? So plants that were in the Gulf Coast moved 800 kilometers into the Bighorn Basin during the hyperthermal event. That was such a huge observation when we first discovered that in the basin that it got the cover of Science magazine. For some perspective there. It was a major observation to show that the forests can move by that much so quickly with climate change. Then, during the body of the event, during the climate interval itself, once things had moved very far north, including things all the way up into the very, very high latitudes where there was no ice on the poles, they then moved between continents. You know, they just sort of occupied the northern areas of all those continents that were connected with each other by land bridges. After the climate event, when things started to cool down, plants then moved south again. So plants that were, you know, and so that includes the things that had moved north. When things started to cool down, they came back into the basin. Those are the extirpated ones, and so on and so forth. But I think that's what the floral data tell us. That's what the plant data tell us. This all makes sense, right? I mean, it's actually a very common sense it's kind of neat to see that that's what happened. But it also matches a little bit of our predictions of what you might expect. So, question, do mammals track specific habitats? In other words, are the mammals that are coming from Europe and Asia, is the timing of when those things come, does that match when the plants are moving back and forth, or in those same pattern distributions? That's a good question. So, again, to look at it now in time here, this is the climate event right here. And so this is the early in the event, and then you go up through the event, and you have recovery, and you're after the event here. So this is about 170,000 years of time during this hyperthermal event. This is when we have plants coming up the Gulf Coast, coming from the south to the north. This is when those plants go back south again, up here at the end of the event. But it's also when we see things coming from Europe and Asia, because they moved around during the event, and then as things cooled again, they came in, you know, into the basin for the first time. And so if the mammals that we see coming in from Europe and Asia, we're tracking their habitat, we should see them coming in here at the end of the event. That would be the prediction. Make sense? That needs to make sense.
Yes.
Okay, good. Yeah. So here are a bunch of the immigrant mammalian lineages that I've documented in this section, and this is when they come in. So, and this is when they should have come in, but they come in down here. So the first occurrences of these things coming from Europe and Asia do not correspond with plant intercontinental immigrants or even the return of extirpated taxa. They occur way down here. They do correspond with plant intracontinental immigrants, things from in the south. So the way to think about that is you've got forests coming from the south into the Bighorn Basin, and you've got mammals coming from the north into those forests, into the Bighorn Basin, but not tracking their preferred forest biome at all. That was not expected, and challenges some of our underlying assumptions about how mammals will move with climate change, I think. Maybe. The bottom line is this is sort of a map of, you know, what these different kinds of forests might have looked like back in the Eocene, using a lot of different types of data pulling together. It's very coarse resolution. But you can see they're tropical forests, warm temperate forests, boreal forests, savanna, dry woodland, grass, dry shrubland, desert, dry tundra, tundra land, ice. They're all over the place as you move up. But, you know, that movement of things is happening up in here, right? with these types of forests. You can see in the Bighorn Basin, you're essentially in a tropical to subtropical forest. But for all those mammals to come in, they're coming through all these different biomes here. I meant the forests in the Bighorn Basin are just coming from down in the Gulf Coast up into the Bighorn Basin. So it indicates that these immigrants are arriving ahead of their preferred forests, and that they have an ability to take advantage of a broad range of habitats with different resources and seasonal cycles, and that these patterns are not simply the result of expanding habitat, as you might assume when you're using things like ecological niche modeling to project what future ranges of things might be. Maybe. Another pattern here is that, in fact, many of the immigrants that we see are mammals and ungulates. Those are the really good dispersers, remember? Many of them, 10 of 14 that we've been able to document are mammals and ungulates. That matches expectation. What's weird is that insectivores and primates form 4 out of 14 of those immigrants. Those are the ones that are not supposed to be able to disperse quickly. Again, that contradicts that model, specifically for those little ones, which is interesting. So the question of whether mammals are coming from Asia and Europe are following their preferred forests into North America, the answer is no. That's the answer to that question, even though our prediction would have been maybe yes. Are the endemic North American mammals following the forest as it moves north with warming and south with cooling, so within the continent of North America? And the answer is also no, which is also puzzling, but no with a question mark, because the long answer is it's kind of a complicated question. And what I mean by that is if you look at the record of these animals here, this is the beginning of the climate event, this is the end of the climate event, and this is documenting a well-known pattern in mammals associated with global warming, which is that they get smaller, and then they get larger again as things get cooler. In other words, they're dancing with climate change. Their body size is highly influenced by temperature. And in fact, when we documented this in horses in the Bighorn Basin associated with these plant records, that was also a paper in Science, because that was considered a pretty interesting observation that dwarfing can be a reaction to climate change in mammals. And in fact, if we look at a bunch of mammals in our section, they all follow a very similar pattern. So these are horses. This is an animal called Ictosian, which is also getting smaller during the event. And this is paleotemperature record from oxygen isotopes from the teeth of these very same animals. From the same animals that we're measuring here for body size, we're looking at the oxygen isotopes of their teeth, which is a good proxy for paleotemperature. Relative shift. So this shows you the relative shifts, that it's getting warmer, stays warm, gets cooler, so on. That's in their teeth, and exactly coincident with that, you see what we call dwarfing, or getting smaller in these lineages. Why? Well, okay, short answer is this is a well-known phenomenon where mammals that have stable internal body temperatures, which are maintained by the food that they eat, they're endothermic, have this relationship with temperature. So as temperature becomes warmer, they have increasingly more difficult ability to disperse the heat in their body to maintain a constant temperature. So think of something the size of an elephant, has to flap its ears for temperature regulation. It's so big it can't lose its heat fast enough, versus something like a shrew, which has to eat all the time to maintain the same temperature as an elephant, because it's constantly losing heat. Sort of like my little daughter gets a lot colder than I do when we go into the snowy weather, because I'm massive and she's not. Well, that's a body mass to surface area ratio and heat loss, and that's sort of shown by so that would be me. That would be my daughter in terms of giving out heat. So this is a well-known type of thing. It's called, this is generally called Bergmann's rule, in the sense of that there are declines that have been documented on continents that show that as you shift through latitudes that have different temperatures, you'll see smaller and larger animals reflecting this. There are huge exceptions to Bergmann's rule. Now, on the Titanoboa front, I feel like I have to talk about Titanoboa just for a second, because it's the counterpoint to the mammals. So we did find Titanoboa down in the tropics of South America. I went to the tropics of South America as I was looking for things that we'd never found before. We knew nothing about the tropics in South America during this time. And since that's a hotspot of biodiversity today, it probably was in the past, so that was important to go there and look. When we went, we found something that was unexpected, which was a giant snake. And the question is, was it expected to find a really giant snake? And the answer is yes. If you go to the hottest place on Earth, in the Paleocene, when things were a lot hotter, you might find larger snakes. Why? Because they're a different kind of animal. They're called poikilotherms, and that is to say, or we think of them as cold-blooded. And that is their body temperature is dependent on the ambient temperature. And that's really, so they get to get up to a body temperature where they can move and eat, they need to absorb temperature from the external environment. And that becomes more and more difficult as they get bigger and bigger and bigger. So it's called a mass-specific metabolic rate. And in fact, there's a diagram showing poikilotherms where the largest things of those different groups shows where they are, and they're clustered around the tropics today. Well, anyway, so we used that relationship and we flipped it on its head. And when we found this giant snake, which was 45 to 50 feet long, would have slithered by me up to my waist, we were able to use that, essentially the metabolism of snakes that we know today, and sort of flip that on its head and use the snake specifically as a paleothermometer to try to tell how hot it must have been in the past to build a snake of that size, based on what we know about the physiology of snakes today. And the answer is it was a lot warmer. So in the Paleocene, it was much warmer today. In the tropics of Colombia, and the snakes were much larger. So I won't talk about Titano anymore, other than to say there is a relationship in the past between one of the things that we can look at on top of the distribution of things and whether plants and animals are tracking each other, is also there is a larger phenomenon where we can see a relationship between body size, where we expect smaller mammals and larger reptiles associated with big shifts in climate, maybe. So, I always sort of end with this kind of perspective, which is fossils, as recorded in rocks, are data from natural experiments that test hypotheses about the response of animals to climate change on a scale that is completely not approachable by modern ecologists. We can't create this in a lab, and you can't observe this over 1 to 15 to 20 to 30 years of research data on modern ecosystems. You can't do it. These are global experiments that have been run over very long timescales. And really all we need to do is get out west, pay for a can of beans, put our tents up, and gather the results of these incredible global experiments on the Earth. So this is just a sum up of what I talked about here today. But really, there's still a lot we don't know, especially for the small mammals, is why we keep on going out. Very big statements require lots of data and a very convincing presentation of those data. And in some cases, even with the biggest statements about evolution, it can take 20 years to publish, which I was just having a conversation about this earlier. But it's a slow burning project because we just need a lot of information to be able to put this together in a convincing manner. So we keep collecting fossils. This is a picture of an Inuit holding a picture of the Okefenokee swamp up in the high latitudes to show you what that might look like in the next couple of 100 years. So if I have another minute, maybe? Okay. I just wanted to highlight, Richard's going to come talk, I think, next week, so I'm sure he'll talk about Mudbrook. And I just wanted to make the point that we're going to start, we've had a dig outside of Williston. This is one of my favorite parts about living in Florida, is that we can collect fossils all the time. We've been digging outside of Williston at this Montbrook fossil dig, which was 5 to 6 million years ago, since 2015. We're starting again this month, and we'll be digging through. We got money from the Felburn Foundation that's funding us to dig through the fall, and we hope through the spring. It's been an incredible opportunity to involve students to get experience, in the field, to work with over 500 volunteers that we have digging at the site, which is sort of a unique experience for graduate students who are going into my field to have. It's something they can put on their CV. It makes their job applications much more competitive. When they get onto the job market, they can say that they've had this kind of supervisory experience, leadership experience, because many museums and many departments are looking for people who have that kind of experience. So anyway, I just wanted to mention that. But also, what's really exciting for me is that working with a really nimble group on the exhibits and public programs side of the museum, we've been able to translate, all of this discovery that's happening in this really unique spot in Williston into the public space pretty effectively, I think, and quickly, which is unusual for museums. Here's an example of some of the really cool. This is an alligator fossil. There's the head. You can see the skeleton. Here's a new species of alligator. 5 to 6 million years ago. We have dozens of articulated skeletons of this new species, which is really special. It's really a very unique type of preservation. And so the volunteers who are working with this, the students who are working with this isn't just some kind of like Disneyland ride. We're actually discovering stuff in real time, as we're doing this, which is also really fun to involve people with. But this was a quick exhibit that was put, this is just sort of a hallway as you come out of the Hall of Fossils at the Florida Museum of Natural History. It's called, it's What's Trending or whatever. It was put in a few years ago. And we try to highlight volunteers, and we have little information here about each person who found each fossil, in the exhibit, and so that was put up. And then a little bit motivated by that, we have the Science Up Close, which is the fantastic fossils exhibit, where I've literally moved my whole lab, my preparation lab, which includes Jason Bork and now Rachel Narducci, into that space. And you can see it's not like if you go to the Smithsonian or many of these other places where you go and see their prep labs that are on display, they're behind glass. You don't really know what people are doing very well. And it's not quite as engaging as you might want it to be. What's really fun about this exhibit is that the walls are sort of taken down and people have an opportunity to talk with people and ask them questions about what they're doing. Furthermore, we're not giving folks that are in that prep lab scientifically insignificant fossils. We're giving them really important stuff. So there's real stories there to tell about what they're working on. This is the first one of such and such, the oldest saber-toothed cat skull, from the Smilodontian lineage in the world. Oh my goodness, the oldest swan skeleton, and right here, right now. And this has also been a great space to we've done live from the field broadcast. When we start in Monpro, people, I'm in there somewhere, ask questions while we're digging about what we're doing. We have a virtual reality experience set up so people can put on the VR headset and actually go out to Montbrook and check it out, and so on and so forth. So it's been a really fun experimental space. We'll be there till January 2nd. It's going to take down, and we'll have a new Science Up Close exhibit, in-house developed exhibit on insects there. Again, featuring some of the science that's happening at the Florida Museum as well as around campus. So anyway, if you're, all of these things require a village, in terms of building, providing this, not only in terms of the science that we're doing, but also, making sure students are well funded so they can take advantage of these experiences, as well as translating those experiences so the public and K through 12 and so on and so forth can experience it. All of it takes money. So always looking for anybody who's interested in helping fund any of this stuff. So that is, I think, it. Yes. Did I lose everybody online? Probably went over by a lot.
Mic test. Thank you very much. Mic test. Thank you very much. I'd wanted to include a guided tour of fantastic fossils in this program, but we've just literally run out of weeks. too much to share. Thank you very much for again putting us through the process of paleontology. I tried to do a little bit of that in the first talk, and also relating the findings to climate change, which we had a big program on climate change last spring, and we're going to have another one in the summer, which everybody's going to get sick and tired of, I suppose. But nevertheless, that's very informative. And I hadn't read anything about what you were talking about. So do we have questions from the audience? Anybody? No? Okay, John?
I'm wondering what's special about teeth. Why do your teeth bones last when other skeletal bones don't, evidently. Or am I miss?
No, you're not missing something there. That's an important question. So in some ways, we're just so lucky because yeah, they're generally coated by enamel, which is a harder structure. Yeah, it's a very hard structure. So it actually mechanically sort of acts like a little pebble, and so it preserves very well just because of that incredibly hard substance. What's very lucky for us is that because teeth are designed to occlude, there's really strong constraints on how much variation you can have in the design of a molar, for example. So there's not a lot of experimentation there that doesn't result in bad things. So they're also highly conserved within groups of things. So horses have horse teeth, primates have primate teeth, insectivores have insectivores. They're very characteristic of those groups. There's some convergence, but they're very characteristic. Finally, giant things have big teeth, very, very tiny things have little teeth. That relationship holds up, and so on. So,
that maximum period between the Paleocene and the Eocene, where the temperatures were so high, and then there was a further surge during the Eocene, which I understand was because of the release of methane that had been frozen in ocean sediments. Do you buy into that hypothesis?
Yeah, so that's been one of the big questions about people who are really interested in how all of this would have, because the hypothermal event itself has been a huge focus, in part because there were no people around. So what causes this huge spike in temperature? And then probably more interestingly, what ends it? So it actually ended very quickly at some point. And so there was a big spike in temperature. It seems to be associated based on the carbon isotope data we have with a huge amount of greenhouse gas in the atmosphere. One mechanism for that has been potentially the release of methane clathrates, which are a solid form of methane in the ocean floor. Maybe there's a little global warming, releases those methane clathrates, a huge infusion of greenhouse gases. There's a feedback effect, potentially also coincident with volcanism and a few other factors that would increase that. But the main issue is that I think the big mystery there has been with methane clathrates is that even if you were to release all of the methane clathrate reserves, on the planet at that time, that still wouldn't actually explain all of the greenhouse gas that we got during that time. So there must have been several things going on.
Not all of it. There was also a great deal of volcanism, apparently in the northern hemisphere. What we see is Canada and perhaps
maybe burning of tundra
Scotland.
And things like that could have played a role there too. So there's a bunch of factors. But the more interesting thing is, how did it all go away?
Is what?
How did it all go away? Where did all that greenhouse gas go so quickly? How did it get pulled out of the atmosphere? Yeah, how did it get cold again? How did it get sequestered, as I say? We'd like to know the answer to that question.
We sure would.
Yeah.
Questions on Zoom? Nothing? Okay. Well, thank you so much.
You're welcome.